Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic, and if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic.
Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Fox 3.0 and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto became the immortal sage of wizards, feared by kings, desired by queens part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Grandfather, I still don't think this is a good idea. The worried old man speaking didn't look like he was young enough to have a living grandfather. In fact, he looked at least as old, if not older, than the bedridden man he referred to as grandfather. If anyone has earned their place in the Kami's realm, it is you. You have protected the world for your entire life. Someone else can handle the Biju now. The other man in the room was very old with entirely white hair held back with a very worn forehead protector with the symbol of the village hidden in the leaves. But in spite of his clearly advanced age, he still appeared to be in admirable physical shape, if less so than he once was. He sat partially propped up in his hospital bed as he continued the same discussion, or more accurately argument, he had every time he had recently spoken with his closest living relative. You are right that I have lived a long and full life Hiruzen. Several long and full lives by most people's measure. I am 190 years old, for Kami's sake. I am not afraid of death. But I have spent my entire life protecting people from the power of the Biju. And I have spent a good portion of the last decade finding a way to continue this protection after my death. And I have won. I can do what the Sage of the Six Paths failed to do, and prevent the Biju from being released upon my body's death. How can I refuse to do so? The younger man sighed. The two of them had covered all of this in multiple earlier discussions. He knew that Naruto would never budge once he was convinced something was the right thing to do. But he couldn't keep himself from trying. So you will just throw your soul into this time stream, with no way of determining where or when you will end up, or what will happen when you arrive. Besides, you are basically killing whoever's body you end up in. Can you do that to an innocent child? Naruto frowned. This was the one thing that did bother him, but he couldn't let it stop him. Not killing. Not exactly. Our souls will merge into one. You are right that my soul is so much more than that of a young child's that the vast majority of the newly formed soul will come from mine, but it still isn't killing. And even if it was, as much as I don't like it, I do understand that sometimes people, even innocents, must be sacrificed in order to save others. I was the Hokage for over 40 years, if you remember. And I have killed an almost literally uncountable number of others in my most of 2 centuries as a ninja. Rarely a young child, or not on purpose, but still, the principle remains. Sometimes terrible things are necessary. And on the scale of it, this isn't even that terrible. He continued after a moment's pause, or at least it's not when you consider the alternative. Regardless of any possible preventative measures I could take, it is virtually certain that any other path I take will result in the Biju being free within a handful of generations at the most. I know that even the stories of the terrible acts the tailed beasts committed while free were fading by the time you were born, but it is an evil I cannot allow if I can do something about it. I could split the Jubi as the Sage of the Six Paths did, which would make the Biju beatable, but too many lives are always lost in such things. I could create a series of behavior modifications with the Sharingan, but that would never last. The tailed beast's chakra will inevitably corrupt whatever form I created for them. I could even go ahead and make another 9 Jinchuriki to hold them in my stead, but as I said, that system would never last more than a few generations before they were released, or their container was killed and they reformed. There is no possible lasting safety from the Biju if I allow their escape after I die, and this is the only way to prevent that. The slightly younger old man sighed, but pressed on in spite of knowing he was defeated. He knew this would be his last chance to convince his grandfather. What if you taught someone the seal sequence you used to use to take another's Kekkei Genkei? They could take your bloodlines just as you took them in your youth. It would kill you, but with you dying anyway. He hesitated and gave a tiny shrug, before continuing, and another with your bloodlines, especially the Rinnegan, could take the Jubi and hold it as you do. I'm certain that one of my grandsons could be trusted with this, and they could pass it down once they approach death as well. This would have the added benefit of maintaining the peace you have established. There has been no great ninja war since the 4th. You know that this is because of you. You declared there would be no more war between the villages, and there is none with the power to go against your word, even now. For that matter, from what I have read, there are only about half as many ninja as there were in your youth. The world is just a lot safer than it once was and fewer are needed, in spite of higher populations. That all goes away with your death. How many will die once there is no longer any with the power which everyone knows cannot be resisted to maintain the peace? How long will it take before war breaks out once again? No, I have sworn I would never teach that, nor will I allow my power to be passed on, Naruto responded with a strong frown. As much as I trust your judgment, or how much I trust your grandchildren or anyone else, you can never be entirely certain what someone will do with this sort of power once they have it. And if not them, all it would take is one mistake in judgment as they pass the power to another. Even a good man can do great evil in a misbegotten attempt at creating a utopia or some such. Or if they feel that the world would simply function better united. Or any of 100 different reasons why even a good man might be willing to use my full power with less than the greatest restraint. And the damage they could do would be so much worse than that were even one to be corrupted, as great power is wont to do. I will not allow it. But I did not ask you to come here to argue things we have already argued about though. I asked you to come so that I could say goodbye. I have said goodbye to the others already, those few who remain who I am still close to. So it is time for us to say goodbye as well. This is the only way that the power of the Biju can remain safely contained for all time. It may not be a perfectly ideal solution, but it is one that will save countless lives down through however many centuries that will come before my soul is reborn. Growing desperate to dissuade his grandfather, Hiruzen continued, but you don't have any idea where or when you will be reborn. You said you had no way of controlling that, now or when you are in the time stream. What if you get put into a situation that just makes things much worse somehow? You have no way of knowing what the result of this will be. Why take such a risk? Yes, there will eventually be danger if the Biju are released, but it is now well recorded how to deal with them should it really be needed, which wouldn't likely come for centuries. You can't know that things won't turn out much worse taking this path, since you have no way of controlling what happens after you use this ability. Naruto nodded in agreement. True enough. I have no way of knowing, and no way of controlling anything that happens after I release my soul and everything I have linked to my soul from my physical body. But the way the jutsu is set up will cast that upon destiny. I was born a child of destiny and prophesy. There will come a time when such a one is born again. When the power I have gained, and the knowledge I have amassed is needed in this world again, beyond simply to keep the threat of the Biju at bay. It is then that destiny will release my soul into a new body. I have no idea when this will be. It could be next year, or it could be in 1,000. But destiny, as terrible as it can make your life as you live it, has a certain method to its apparent randomness. Certainly no guarantee that things will turn out well, but I highly doubt I will be put in a situation in which I am reborn and instantly killed, releasing the Jubi upon the masses. That doesn't seem like it would fit with a child of destiny, whatever that child's ultimate fate. And anything else, I can deal with as it arrives. With one last possibility, Hiruzen suggested, what if I did the same thing and went with you? Or perhaps more than just me. From what you said, it seems likely we would be put into the same time, with destiny guiding our soul's placement. It would probably be easier if there were at least some of us from this life to help you in your next. With a shake of his head, Naruto said, no, first because you would not be able. I have calculated the chakra requirements for the technique, and I doubt anyone other than a Jinchuriki, and powerful one at that, would be able to give the chakra required. Maybe if someone with very high-level cage-level reserves opened all 8 gates, ate some food pills, and drank hero water, they might have enough chakra, and might last long enough to complete the technique before all of that killed them. Though more likely, their chakra control would be so worthless with that amount of chakra and no practice controlling it that they wouldn't be able to do anything at all with it. But even if others could, I would not have them come with me. They might or might not end up in the same time as me. More likely not, given the near infinite range of time that exists. I also don't want this technique to ever have a chance to spread. It is a sort of method of immortality, but shouldn't be used as such. Which actually reminds me of an additional reason this is a good idea. I have always been a bit worried of the possibility of someone bringing me back with the impure world resurrection after I die. In spite of my best efforts, knowledge of that particular kinjutsu has never been entirely stamped out, and I would make an enormously tempting target. Which I both don't want to experience, and I don't want anyone to have such power over others, especially the sort of people who are generally willing to use a technique like that. But since my soul will have been thrown forward in time, this won't be a possibility. The Sage of the Six Paths managed to do something to prevent techniques like that from working as well, but I'm not sure what it was, and this will work just as well. Hiruzen sagged in defeat. He had known for weeks that his arguments would not succeed. But he felt he had to try. Naruto had done more, and sacrificed more through his life for others and for what he felt was his duty than anyone else living. It wasn't right that he be forced into an eternal duty to remain ever vigilant against something he never really had a choice about from his birth. But there was nothing that could be done. Even as sick as he was, Naruto would never submit to something he didn't agree to. The only thing to do was to wish him luck and pray that he may find happiness in his next life. Very well, grandfather. I'll miss you, and I love you, and I will make sure that people remember you for what you have done for them. Naruto now smiled as he responded. Thank you. I will miss you as well, along with everyone else, but most of those that I truly treasured as my precious people have already passed on. I wish I could stay here for though. But as that choice has been taken from me, it is time for me to move on. I am just doing it a little differently than most do. His smile grew. Not that anyone should be surprised by that. I have always done things a little differently. Naruto and Hiruzen shared a long hug before Naruto was finally released with a sad smile shared between the two of them. Hiruzen left his hand sitting on his grandfather's shoulder. Is there anything else I can do for you? Can I help you to wherever you plan on completing your seals, or get any medicine for you? I could even help with some of the sealing, if you would like. I may not be nearly as skilled or knowledgeable as you, but I am a seal master in my own right, and could at least help with some of the basic structuring of the seals. Naruto patted the hand on his shoulder as he responded, thank you, but no. I can just kamui over to my room, and I do all my sealing these days with chakra strings anyway, so my difficulty moving much scarcely matters. But I wouldn't mind spending another hour or two talking of old times. You know how old people get. He gave a grin that still remained in some indescribable way fox-like. In spite of the Kyuubi having long since been destroyed when the Jubi was recreated. But even that smile kept a hint of sadness remaining to be seen by those who really knew him well enough to see through even Naruto's well-perfected masks. And so most of Naruto's last hours in the elemental nations passed, reminiscing of times long since past, and hopes for the future and for their descendants. But eventually it was time, so after one final hug and not a few tears, Naruto briefly activated his Sharingan eyes and warped space to put him in the ritual room he had created for himself decades before. The room was a perfect cube made entirely of white marble walls with no door or connecting building or tunnels of any kind, for that matter. In fact, the room existed about a half-mile below the surface of the earth in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nothing connecting it to anything. Not that anyone else knew that. Naruto actually had to create oxygen from time to time while he was here, which was one of the more amusing uses of the creation of all things technique. But even for someone with his skill, not to mention a dozen clones, It took almost 7 hours to carefully guide the sealing ink into the awesomely complicated sealing structures which covered every inch of all of the walls, floor, and ceiling. After verifying every one of those inches, Naruto carefully lifted himself up until he hovered in the exact center of the room, purely using his mastery over the wind and gravity elements, and began a series of over 1,000 hand seals, while simultaneously carefully pouring massive amounts of chakra into specific sections of the sealing structure in order to carefully create one of the most complicated techniques ever activated. Finally, the technique was complete, and as Naruto's body died and his soul was ripped from it and mostly out of reality as it entered directly into the time stream, Naruto felt pain beyond anything he had ever experienced before. And Naruto was no stranger to pain. But this was agony beyond what could be felt by simple nerves in a human body. And the pain felt unending. Later, Naruto would never be sure exactly how long it lasted. It might have been a minute, or it might have been millennia, but at the time it certainly felt eternal. But as the pain finally and with abruptly ended, a feeling of perhaps to be expected disorientation came over him as his now open eyes were filled with the lingering flash of bright green light. It was odd being in a new body, he decided. The fact that the body in question was that of a toddler probably didn't help. But he didn't really have time to worry about it at the moment, as several things happened very quickly in the first few seconds after his arrival. Of course, the first thing he had to deal with was the extremely strange feeling of two souls merging. For an instant, he could actually feel the sensation from two perspectives as information began to bleed over between the two souls before they had truly merged. This only lasted for the tiniest fraction of a second before what was once two souls became one. Of course, he had to deal with the disorientation of suddenly having two sets of experiences to work through. It wasn't actually as if he suddenly absorbed all the memories of the child. He had actually experienced that a few times when he had used the Rinnegan's ability to absorb the memories of a ripped-out soul. No, this was different. In this case, rather than absorbing a set of memories, he simply suddenly had two sets of experiences. Two sets of simultaneous knowledge and feelings that ran into each other about a second ago and continued as one from that point on. Given that one of these sets was 190 years of clear memories and the other was the vague and short memories and feelings of a 15-month-old, Naruto's long years were dominant as would be expected. But it was still quite a strange sensation to not just be aware of what happened so far in Harry's life, but to remember experiencing it. To feel the love both from and towards his parents as he remembered them holding him. Too bad that even the rudimentary understanding of what was going on and the language spoken his younger self had seemed to indicate that said parents had likely died moments before. It was truly tragic to have both your parents killed in front of you when you were still a young child. Twice. But he had little time to even begin to feel grief as the surprising lack of pain from the soul merging gave way to an extreme amount of pain as all of the things he had linked to his soul applied themselves to his new body. In that moment, the bloodlines which had been attached to his older soul before his previous death, and more importantly, the seal containing the Jubi applied themselves to his body. As he had expected, this was excruciatingly painful. This was not particularly surprising, given that his genetic code was simultaneously being rewritten while the chakra of the greatest of the Biju, and Naruto's own spiritual energy began to flow through his undeveloped chakra coils. Fortunately, a child of under about 2 years old still had very flexible chakra coils and they were able to stretch and widen as a sudden massive flow of chakra began to run through his coils. But even this would not have been enough had it not been for the simultaneous application of some of the other advantages Naruto had brought with him. Between the Uzumaki chakra augmentations, his Biju enhanced regeneration and the benefits of being able to guide his own chakra with the power of the Rinnegan, he managed to survive the experience, but it was still incredibly painful. In fact, it probably would have been enough to knock him unconscious were it not for the much greater torment Naruto's soul had experienced traveling through the time stream moments before. And it was a very good thing that he was still conscious, because a few seconds after his arrival, he felt a sudden intrusion. For a moment, he thought it was an attempt to mindwalk him, but the mental barriers Ino had taught him were still standing strong. Then he realized that someone was attempting a soul possession on him. It was an interesting coincidence, because he had spent a significant portion of the last decade of his life studying the soul manipulation techniques that Orochimaru had originally pioneered. In fact, he had been forced to move beyond what Orochimaru had been capable of, at least in some areas, in order to achieve the final technique that had brought him to this point. So he knew exactly how to counter an attempt at a soul possession. All it took was a focused flare of chakra while using the Rinnegan and its absolute control over yin chakra. And with that, Harry forced the soul attempting to possess him out of his body away. However, now that he could actually sit up and look at it, forcing himself to ignore the cooling body of his mother for the moment, he found that the soul possession attempt was very different from any that he had read about before. First, there was no way that little Sliver was possibly actually a whole soul, but he couldn't figure out a reason why someone would mutilate a soul, much less how they could survive it. Second, upon him forcing the piece of soul out, it should have been forced to either return to its original body, or move on should the original body be dead, which seemed likely, given the smoking pile of charred robes. And third, there seemed to be some energy maintaining the soul, and pushing it to try and find some sort of host. Most interesting of all was the fact that whatever this energy was, it wasn't chakra. In fact, as far as the Sharingan could tell, it was entirely made up of spiritual energy, which he previously thought couldn't be used without molding it together with physical energy to make chakra. Apparently he had been wrong, and while this energy was significantly less potent than chakra, it seemed it could so some delicate tasks that chakra likely could not, even with the best chakra control. Or at least he couldn't think of any way that chakra could maintain a soul outside of a body for any significant amount of time. But on the plus side, that made tearing away the energy maintaining the piece of soul so it could move on fairly simple through the pure brute force of chakra. And so he went ahead and did exactly that and allowed that piece of soul, at least to move on, though he had no idea what having only part of you going to the afterlife would do. This would have to be something he contemplated later. For now, he extended his senses to make sure there was at least no immediate threat, though he did note a great deal of this spiritual energy in the area, some of it even still active. None of it seemed directed at him or malevolent though, so he went ahead and carefully lifted himself out of his crib with wind and gravity chakra and floated over to his mother. As he leaned against her still chest and began to cry, he realized that this was both a blessing and a curse. It was wonderful, in a way, to have actual memories of parents who loved and cared for him. It was something he had never experienced in Naruto's life, even though he knew from later stories that they had loved him even before he was born. But here he had actual memories of them caring for him and protecting him, hours spent playing with him, or just holding him, pouring out the parental love a part of him had always craved. Everything that he had tried to give his own children, but never experienced for himself. But it was taken from him so quickly, leaving only grief over the loss of his parents and over the loss of the chance to grow up with them, lost forever because his soul had merged only minutes too late to save them. Harry was still there and still crying when his uncle Padfoot arrived a few minutes later. Looking back at his memories, he was pretty sure his uncle's name was actually Sirius, though he seemed to laugh a lot about that name, so maybe that was a nickname. Regardless, he hurried over to Harry and his mother with tears streaming down his face, though he seemed extremely relieved that Harry at least was alive. Padfoot first examined him for injury and finding none besides the small scar on his forehead with a tiny amount of blood from before Harry's regeneration had kicked in to seal the wound shut. After this was done, he carefully picked Harry up and with a last hesitant glance back at Lily, and a considerably longer one which came with a choked sob at James's body downstairs, they left the house. Once they got outside, they were met by another man. A very, very large man. It was a little difficult to figure out exact sizes when he was so small and his perspective was from his uncle's arms, but just comparing him to his uncle, this man had to be nearly 10 feet tall and nearly half that wide. But clearly his uncle knew this man, and didn't consider him a threat. After a brief conversation, most of which Harry didn't understand with his limited comprehension of the language, Padfoot's grief began to transition into anger. He then handed Harry over to the large man before disappearing with a crack. Once again, this was accomplished through the use of spiritual energy alone. A fairly subtle one at that, as it appeared to create a space-time wormhole through which the user could travel. It would certainly require a lot less energy than the Kamui or the Hiraishin, but he doubted it was as effective. But before he could really consider this further, the large man gave a few sniffles, or Harry supposed they could be called that, though they didn't really sound like any sniffle he had heard from a human before. The large man then carried Harry over to what ended up being a flying transportation device which was again powered by spiritual energy. During the fairly long flight, Harry began to attempt to work his way through his feelings about the night. Although he hadn't expected this life to be any easier than his last one, he really hadn't thought that he would experience such trauma immediately upon arrival. But at least he had a lot of good memories of his parents to focus on, for now at least. And it appeared he had a lot of people who already cared about him. His uncles Padfoot, Wormtail, Mooney, his Aunt Alice, and even apparently this big guy, who seemed to be talking to him softly throughout most of the trip, in spite of the fact that the wind was too loud to hear him at all. But luckily the Sharingan could both give the ability to read lips, as well as a perfect memory of their movements for when Harry learned the language well enough to reconstruct his words. Regardless, being around others who cared for him should help him work his way through even so abrupt a loss. Or so he thought, until they landed and he was placed on a doorstep in a basket in front of some random house with a note. Were they just going to leave him here? If Harry had discovered one thing during the 4 years since the soul merge, it was that the similarities between Naruto and Harry's situations were uncanny. At first, he had thought that he was looking for similarities that didn't exist. He had a tendency to do that. But in this case, he was pretty sure he wasn't seeing things that were not there. Both were orphaned young because their parents fought against an evil which was attempting to destroy their society. In fact, both children had apparently been specifically targeted by said evil, and both mothers had leapt between the children and death. Both were hated in their childhood by those around them for a power which they did not choose to have. Both were referred to exclusively by a slur. It didn't really matter if it was the demon or the freak. Either way, people refused to refer to him by his name. Even their physical appearance had its similarities. Both had a facial disfigurement which apparently even the Biju's regeneration couldn't fix. Both had untamable hair, and both had unnaturally bright eyes, if of different colors. But perhaps it shouldn't have surprised him. It seemed that destiny liked to play the same stories over and over again. He had noticed it back in Konoha too. Ninja teams kept repeating history with pairings of detached genius, fangirl of said genius, and dead last Joker who at least thought they were in love with the fangirl. His own team had just followed in the footsteps of Kakashi's team, and even the Sannin in many ways. Even technological development seemed oddly familiar. Of course it wasn't the same. Every indication was that the society of the elemental nations had been entirely lost and humanity had started over again at some point lost in the distant past. Modern technology was much more common and had followed down many paths to do things impossible in the elemental nations. But what were the chances of both societies developing virtually identical televisions or microwaves? On the other hand, modern society had also developed instant ramen, so perhaps destiny could be forgiven its trespasses. But he should really focus more on the present rather than odd philosophical ponderings. The present being his uncle's fist heading towards his face. But it wasn't like he didn't have time for his random musings. His uncle's attack was almost painfully slow, not to mention telegraphed. He really should decide what to do with his uncle this time though. His past 2 warnings hadn't worked, apparently. The first time Vernon had tried to hit Harry for backtalk 6 months ago, Vernon had, accidentally, tripped and shattered his jaw on the table in mid-lunge for the freak. A few months later, after physical therapy, Vernon had tried to hit him again, apparently for being sloppy with his chores, and an overhanging tree branch had happened to break and fall on him, breaking his collarbone, arm, and giving him a concussion. It was quite odd though. The Dursleys appeared to both simultaneously blame him for these events and everything else that went wrong in their lives, while at the same time believing that he wouldn't do it again if they kept up their behavior. Granted, a lot of the things that went wrong in their lives were his fault, but they deserved to be pranked for their attempted treatment of him. The only time he did anything harmful was when they tried to actually hurt him. A lot of those had been pretty entertaining too, at least from his perspective. He hadn't done anything the first year because he was focusing on getting used to the changes in his chakra that came with the soul merge to allow him to use the full powers of his eyes and other abilities once again. Besides, at that point, all the Dursleys did was ignore him and underfeed him. The first was pretty annoying, but could be ignored in turn, and the second could be solved by stealing food from both the Dursleys and grocery stores. But after that, the verbal abuse got worse. They started piling on excessive chores, increased the efforts at mild starvation, and more frequent attempts to lock him up in the cupboard for long periods of time. Not that he didn't leave whenever he felt like it, but they didn't know that. He didn't mind the chores, as shadow clones under an invisibility genjutsu made even the impossible amount of chores demanded of him something easy to ignore. That in itself seemed to drive them a little crazy, as the chores were always completed, but they almost never saw him doing them. Which made them certain he was using his unnaturalness to do them, but he just ignored them when they yelled about it. The starvation attempts were also easily ignored, as food was easily obtained. The verbal abuse was kind of annoying though. He liked to think of himself as a lot more secure in who he was than he had been during his first childhood, so he didn't really let it get to him. But it did get really old when they constantly yelled at him for his unnaturalness and never even called him by his name, just freak or boy. So they made excellent prank targets for the next few years. Of course, they were not the only people pranked. There were plenty of other good targets around, especially now that he was going to school. He just had to keep those pranks toned down to this side of possible. But for the Dursleys, he especially enjoyed pranks that were blatantly impossible, but yet small enough that no one outside of the normality-obsessed Dursleys really noticed the impossibility. Things like repainting the entire house to a professional standard in bright orange overnight. He had done that 7 or 8 times now, they kept having it repainted back. Moving the garden and other plants around overnight, but making it look like it had always been like that with Mokudan techniques. Replacing the car with an entirely different model every day for a month. Teleporting Vernon and his car to work immediately after he climbed in from the driveway. Invisibly tying shoelaces together in the middle of company meetings. With pranks like that, he got to enjoy it twice. Once of them reacting to the prank itself, and a second time as they realized the degree to which they were affected by unnaturalness. But in spite of no one else suspecting the supernatural, pretty much everyone referred to them as that weird Dursley family now. Except for Harry, who dressed nicely despite the Dursleys' best efforts, was quite fit for his age, and was always very polite and apologetic for his strange relatives. The fact that everyone pretty openly thought that Harry was the normal one and the rest of the Dursleys were weird and possibly insane was probably the best prank of all. And of course, every time the Dursleys tried to contact a realtor about moving, they ended up calling Air driving to a strip club instead. It turned out that despite how little he had relied on it in his earlier life, genjutsu was a lot of fun. Of course, he didn't restrict his pranks just to the advanced use of chakra techniques he had developed in his later life as Naruto. There was also plenty of inspiration to be drawn from his academy days before he could really use chakra at all. The only downside was that it was far too easy to get away with. Even when he didn't use chakra for assistance, he was used to pranks against highly aware and paranoid ninja. There was no real challenge against civilians, which just motivated him to try for more and more elaborate pranks. He did sometimes wonder if he was sometimes going too far and might actually drive them insane though. He didn't want to actually harm them, and he tried to keep his pranks from getting too malicious. He just hoped he could get them to just accept that weird things happened and were a part of life. Maybe learn to laugh at themselves a little. It didn't seem to be working that well so far, as evidenced by the fist which had still yet to reach his face. Though the secondary goal of providing laughs that lasted for hours was going quite well. With a quick sidestep to avoid the blow, Harry met Vernon's eyes to use a genjutsu on him, making him suddenly freeze and scream, "Another tree branch. You broke my arm, you little freak." Harry shook his head with a sigh. Even with the at this point somewhat reasonable belief that Harry could call down objects to break his bones at will, Vernon still had to be insulting and call him freak instead of his name. In a very concerned voice, he said, "Oh, that doesn't look good. You should go to the hospital, uncle." With a glare that might have been at least a little intimidating to someone else, at least if it were not for the tears streaming down his face, Vernon turned away and ran back into the house. As he yelled for help from Petunia and entered through the door, he cast one last look back at Harry that was a strange mix of rage and fear. Am I going too far? I don't really like actually terrifying them and hurting them, but I can't just let them hit me. Quote. Harry gave a sharp shake of his head and continued muttering to himself, "No, they bring this upon themselves. I don't have to like it, but some people only respond to such tactics. Oh well, I really need to get back to training." Changing the entire interior floor plan of the house and moving all the contents around to match the new locations of the rooms took most of the morning while they were out. "I need to get back to work." With a quick smile and shrug, he created a clone to invisibly follow along after the Dursleys and dropped the genjutsu after Vernon had spent a few minutes arguing with a doctor that his arm was broken and demanding treatment. Those memories would be entertaining. And maybe a mix of pain and humiliation were what was needed to avoid further abuse attempts. As his red eyes began to spin behind his own concealing genjutsu, the world shifted and Harry found himself several hundred miles away in the middle of nowhere in his training base, which he had created from scratch 2 years ago with a combination of powerful earth techniques and the always useful creation of all things technique. And in that 2 years, he had been almost entirely focused on getting back into the perfect physical shape he had enjoyed in his prime. Even with his gravity and resistance seals, it would be at least another decade before he was done, but it was his priority for now. After reviewing the comments his Sharingan had memorized from the large man who had brought him here 4 years ago, whose name was apparently Hagrid, Harry would be going to a school called Hogwarts to learn magic when he was 11. He assumed that was the name for the use of spiritual energy that those people had developed. But it would be a lot easier to learn how from them, so he hadn't put much effort into rediscovering those abilities himself, and instead focused on once again reaching his maximum potential in the abilities he had already mastered long ago. From what he had seen so far, he was relatively certain that those abilities alone would be enough to allow him to defeat anyone he really needed to, so the use of magic was mostly just a curiosity anyway, if a potentially useful one. After all, without including the molding of physical energy with mental energy through the body to reinforce it during training, there was no way to enhance the human body beyond a fairly low natural limit. So by virtue of pure unmatchable speed alone, he should be able to overwhelm anything magic could throw at him, much less everything else chakra could provide. So for now, he focused on what he knew and started yet another set of push-ups. "Boy, have you finished your chores yet? What are you doing inside?" Vernon snarled viciously at Harry. "And what are you eating? You had breakfast. Get outside, and don't come back until dinner. And where did you even get that?" Harry's eyes never left the not yet boiling liquid as he waved Vernon away and continued preparing his 8th bowl of ramen. "It's my 8th birthday. I'm not doing chores today. And since you didn't get me a present, I'm making myself one. So leave me alone, ya fat bastard." Judging by the rapidly darkening colors of Vernon's face, Harry knew he probably shouldn't have said that. But he had been able to use the somewhat limited medical techniques he knew to save Vernon the last time he had a stroke in similar circumstances, so it would probably be fine. And though he was better than he once was, he still tended to not watch his mouth quite as much as he should. It took a full 2 minutes for Vernon to finally slow his breathing and force himself down from attacking his nephew. In a voice that was more growl than actual words, he said, "Fine, but you had better be in your cupboard early tonight, and up early to get them done tomorrow." Harry was already eating by that point, but that was strange enough that it was almost enough to make him stop while he considered what was going on. Had Vernon had a stroke after all? He would have to think about it later. Sometimes he wished he had been able to convince the Yamanaka to teach him how to mindwalk someone. Though after a little further thought, he supposed he might not actually want to see what was in Vernon's head. For now though, there was more ramen to make. He restricted himself to eating it only once a week since the importance of a decent diet in physical development had finally been beaten into him last time through. In his 30s. But hey, no one is perfect, and it looked like he wouldn't be as short this time around. But when he allowed himself to have it, he was certainly going to enjoy it, and his uncle acting even more strangely than normal wasn't going to stop that. That night when Vernon came into the cupboard with a knife, Harry considered that maybe he should have spent at least a little time thinking about it. The past 3 years had gone by relatively peacefully. Vernon being committed to the mental ward probably had a lot to do with that. But when Vernon started actually foaming at the mouth and screaming random obscenities after Harry had offered him breakfast the day after his 8th birthday, the authorities really didn't have many options. Eventually it came out that Vernon claimed he murdered Harry the previous night and buried him in a ditch because Harry was an evil freak who had to die for bringing unnaturalness into his family. The police had been quite concerned until they dug up a stabbed stuffed animal with the word freak written on its head. Well, technically they were still quite concerned, but they stopped looking into open missing persons reports. Harry felt a little bad about the whole situation, but the Manahata tried to murder him. He pretty much deserved it. Harry had done everything he could to save Vernon from his own stupidity and bigotry, but ultimately all it did was push Vernon into greater anger, and poison those around him with the same hatred. So Harry washed his hands of the situation, and hoped that maybe some professional help might do Vernon some good. But the Dursley household had really settled down after that. Harry had been given his own room, and was simply avoided by the 2 remaining Dursleys, while Harry did the same. Though of course there was still the occasional prank. The Dursleys had resigned themselves to it at this point, and Dudley even thought they were kind of funny sometimes, at least when they were not aimed at him. And every month, a deposit was made into Petunia's bank account. She tried not to think about the fact that the deposits had started immediately after she had noticed a slightly guilty look on Harry's face when she was crying about what she was going to do without Vernon to provide for them. Best not to ask questions, really. Harry, you have, well, you have a letter. Harry was jerked out of one of his periodic reflective moods as Dudley came into the room with the morning's mail, putting Harry's letter on the table before continuing upstairs. With a shrug, he picked up the offered item, taking a moment to examine the high-quality parchment and wax seal before breaking it open and reading over the letter within. As he did so, he did notice Petunia biting on her lip almost hard enough to draw blood, but she left any objections she might have had silent. Hogwarts Schoola of a Witchcrafta and a Wizardry Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore. Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork. CHF. Warlock, a Supreme Mugwump, International Confed, of Wizards. Dear Harry Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by no later than July 31st. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. After skimming over the second page which listed the supplies needed, he glanced up at Petunia with a wide smile and said, "I'm going to Hogwarts. Do you know what they mean by, 'We await your owl'? And where do you go to get these supplies?" Petunia paled further, if that was possible, before responding in what she was obviously trying to make a strong tone, but which quivered with anxiety. "What makes you think I know? I mean, don't know. And I'm not paying for that school." Harry responded with a shrug. Well, my mother was a witch, so I thought you would know what she did before she went to Hogwarts. Besides, it's always been clear that you know a lot more about the whole unnaturalness business than you said. Harry had been wrong in thinking that she could get no paler, and her voice was barely audible. In fact, Harry had to channel chakra to his ears just to make out his aunt's voice clearly. You knew? How long? You always said you didn't know anything about the weird things that happened? Harry gave a shrug and answered, doesn't really matter. I know some things. I assume they will tell me more at Hogwarts. All I need to know is how to owl a response and how to get my school supplies. And you don't have to worry about paying for it anyway. He grinned even wider than previously. I'll work something out. Petunia looked down at the table for a long moment before finally responding in a slightly stronger voice, though her gaze never left the plate in front of her. Those people use those foul birds to send letters. They just tie a letter onto the thing and tell it who to go to, and it goes. But I don't know where you get your supplies. Someone from that school came and took Lily. The last sentence was delivered in little more than a snarl. Harry nodded thoughtfully before writing out a quick response saying he would like to attend and to please send someone to take him to get his school supplies. Once the note was complete, he went outside and found the owl sitting on the front porch. Even Harry at this point was a little hesitant as he held out the note and spoke to an owl. This needs to go to Hogwarts. However, the owl just hopped closer and offered one of its legs. With a shrug, Harry securely tied the note on and watched as the owl flew away, a little unsure of what to do now. But he supposed he would just have to wait and see what happened. It was not a long wait. In fact, a reply from Hogwarts arrived the very next morning explaining that a representative of the school would arrive in a week's time to escort him to a place called Diagon Alley to purchase his school supplies. That following week was slightly nerve-wracking though. His aunt just avoided him, and Dudley alternated between staring at him with wide eyes and running from him every time he saw him after Petunia had explained that Harry was a wizard and would be going to a magic school in about a month's time. But Harry had long been used to both fear and avoidance from his relatives, so he didn't let it bother him. Instead, he was just excited about finally getting to something interesting. Based on the seals he had used to send Naruto's soul to this time, apparently he had a great destiny and was ready to get started on fulfilling it. Playing with his relatives with pranks and constant training might keep him occupied, but he wanted to get involved in something a little more exciting as soon as possible. So Harry was awake and ready to go on the morning of July 31st, and was the only person at the table who did not jump in shock at the sudden very loud banging on the door. He simply got up and moved to answer it. He did, however, jump slightly when the third knock broke the door right off of its hinges, causing it to collapse in front of a suddenly sheepish-looking giant of a man. "Oh, Air. Don't you worry about that. Fix that up quick, I will." The man, who was the same one who had carried Harry away from his parents' house and to the Dursleys almost a decade ago, carefully hunched over to enter through the broken doorway and gently lifted the door off the ground and propped it up in the place it had once been. Only then did he look around at the three staring people. Harry was only a few steps away, while Petunia and Dudley were both hiding around corners, barely showing enough of themselves to peek at the new arrival. Harry was still a little hesitant, not sure how you were supposed to talk to the guy who just casually knocked down the front door on the way to escort him to buy school supplies. But finally, after a short awkward pause, he eventually said, "Hi. You must be the representative of Hogwarts to take me to Diagon Alley?" "Yeah, that's me. I'm Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." "Just call me Hagrid though. Everyone does." Without pausing, he continued to ramble on, clapping Harry on the shoulder, though he didn't notice either the reflexive tensing when he approached Harry, or that Harry didn't stumble with the blow like other 11-year-olds would. "Ye must be Harry. Haven't seen Ye since you was a baby. Ye look just like her dad, but with her mum's eyes. And I see Ye don't need glasses like her dad did." Harry nodded and smiled. "Thanks, Hagrid. Yeah, I'm Harry. You knew my parents then?" Maybe you can tell me some stories about them when they were in school sometime? My aunt has told me a little about my mum, but, well, they were not really very close after they were kids. Hagrid grinned and wiped at his watery eyes as he responded emotionally. "O' course, Harry. Mum and Dad were great. Knew 'em when they were at Hogwarts. Be glad to tell you all about them." Harry grinned in response. "Thanks, Hagrid. So, are you ready to take us?"
Hagrid nodded enthusiastically, apparently grateful for the change of topic to a less emotional one. "O' course, Harry. Oh, but I almost forgot." He reached into one of the massive pockets that covered much of his overcoat and eventually drew out a cake in a box with a "Happy Birthday Harry" written in green icing. "Think I might 'a' sat on it at some point though. Might be a bit squished, but it should taste all right." "Happy birthday, Harry." Harry was surprised at this. He hadn't had a birthday cake since his first birthday before his parents died, and even if it was a little squished and honestly didn't look like the tastiest cake he had ever seen, even discounting its smashed state, it was still a very nice gesture.
"Thanks, Hagrid. That's really nice of you." He glanced over his shoulder at Petunia and Dudley as he said, "We can just leave it here for now and eat it when I come back tonight. Buddha don't eat any before then." He then looked back at Hagrid and asked, "Maybe you can stop in and share it with us when we get back from the shopping trip?"
Most people might have questioned it as strange that an 11-year-old was basically making demands of his aunt, and even more surprised at the rapid nodding she gave in response. Hagrid was certainly not most people and didn't notice any of this. Instead, he just handed the box to Harry and watched as Harry handed it over to his aunt, touched at Harry's desire to include him in his birthday celebration even though they had just met.
"O' course, Harry. Would be honored. Best be off though. Lot to do today." Harry was excited as well. He had been looking forward to seeing some more magic and trying to figure out exactly how it was done for years now. "So how are we going to get to this Diagon Alley? Are we going to teleport, or fly or something?" "Aaron no going to take the bus, I suppose." A very incredulous and disappointed Harry slowly replied, "The bus?" It turned out that the bus was certainly not like the non-magical variety. Muggles, he was told they were called in the magical world. But though it was a lot faster and able to ignore all traffic, which was definitely a plus, it was also a very uncomfortable ride. Harry might be able to keep his balance easily because of his extensive training, but it was still annoying being constantly thrown around as the bus rapidly changed directions. Teleportation seemed much easier, and he didn't really understand why they hadn't gone that way. Maybe only some people could? But eventually they had reached a dirty little pub called the Leaky Cauldron, which was apparently their destination. Harry had to give Hagrid an odd look, as if asking if this was really where they were supposed to go, but once again Hagrid proved to not be the most observant fellow. Eventually Harry just shrugged and continued to follow him into the dimly lit building that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since before Harry was born.
Once inside, the bartender, an old toothless bald man with matched the shoddy da copyright core, perfectly nodded in recognition of Hagrid and asked, the usual, "Hagrid."
Hagrid once again clapped Harry on the shoulder, and once again didn't notice that Harry wasn't knocked away by the blow, though Harry was at least able to keep his reflexive tensing under control this time. "Can't, Tom. I'm on Hogwarts business." The old man, Tom, apparently, looked closely at Harry before gasping in shock as replied, "Good Lord, is this? Can this be? Bless my soul, Harry Potter. What an honor." At this, the whole bar fell silent and the old bartender rushed around and seized his hand, shaking it vigorously. Was he actually crying? Harry peered more closely at him to confirm this before looking around uncomfortably at all the staring people who likewise rose to rush towards him at this point, each eager to shake his hand or pat him on the back. Or just to be able to be in his presence, evidently. Harry had faced this sort of adoration before in his previous life. There had actually been a fairly sizable religion centered around him being an actual god in the later part of his life in the elemental nations, regardless of what he tried to do to stop it. So this sort of mindless adulation was very recognizable to him. It was totally unexpected though. Harry had mistakenly created an entire picture of how he thought his life would likely go, often using parallels to his prior life based on the numerous similarities he had experienced so far, so this was quite a surprise.
He had fully expected to come into the wizarding world disliked and looked down upon just as he had as a child and teenager as Naruto, and just as he had spent his childhood as Harry as well. Apparently that would certainly not be the case this time. He might have been hated by his relatives, or at best a mix of tolerated and feared lately, but it seemed that he was already loved in the wizarding world.
Did this mean he would have, and he hesitated to even think it, but it must be done. Fangirls? He almost gagged at the thought, but was barely able to maintain a smiling face for the benefit of all the people eager to meet him after being in the Muggle world for almost a decade.
He had been able to mostly avoid fangirls focused on him in his last life. After all, he had already been engaged by the time he had fully turned his reputation around from hated to universally respected, much less this sort of adoration. But it looked like he might have to bear fangirls this time. He was pretty sure that had been what had ultimately tipped the balance and driven Sasuke to evil though, so he would have to be careful.
Eventually Hagrid did usher Harry away from the crowds and through a magical portal through a brick wall into Diagon Alley itself, which he was thankful for.
He might be somewhat used to crowds like that from his other life, but after he had gotten used to the feeling of being acknowledged by so many people, he hadn't really enjoyed it that much. Besides, at least those crowds had loved him for something he actually did, rather than whatever these people loved him for. So, Hagrid, what was all of that about?
Hagrid paused in his steps and looked down at Harry with confusion. What do ya mean, Harry?
All of the handshaking and enthusiastic greetings. The congratulations and well-wishing. That can't be the normal greeting to people entering into the wizarding world for the first time. Hagrid looked shocked at this, but eventually he answered, well, famous Harry. I thought ye knew. Ye know, for killing you know who. Oh, you mean Voldemort. Hagrid flinched at this and quickly waved for Harry to be quiet. He then whispered quietly, or at least quietly for Hagrid, so at a low rumble that couldn't be easily heard from more than a couple dozen feet away, ye shouldn't say his name Harry. I shouldn't say his name. Why not? You actually want me to call him, you know who. What if someone doesn't know who? Hagrid clears his throat and looked around to make sure no one was paying attention, which they amazingly weren't, given the earlier attention he had received. People just on. Like it Harry. You know who scared a lot of people when he was around. Scares them still, I guess. They was dark days, with people disappearing, and anyone who tried to oppose him endin' up dead. Well, 'cept for Dumbledore, o' course. People don. Even like thinkin' 'bout those days, and, you know who was the cause of it all. Harry continued to give an incredulous look throughout the entire explanation. People were so scared of him they were afraid to say his name. And still or a decade later. That's kind of insane. It's not like saying Voldemort's name will make him come back to life to kill you or something. Hagrid once again flinched at Voldemort's name and shrugged uncomfortably. Just the way it is Harry. But when ye got rid o' him. Survived a curse that's never been survived before, and the whole country celebrated. That's why ye are so famous. People call ye the boy who lived. Harry frowned, but nodded. Oh. I always kind of assumed that was because of something my mother did before she was killed. I was only 15 months old, so I don't think there was really anything I could have done to stop Voldemort. I think my mother should be the famous one, not me. I never really thought of it like that. Hagrid stood in deep thought, or deep thought for Hagrid, for a few moments, then shrugged. Well, I don't know. Dumbledore said it was ye that stopped him, and that's good enough for me, and for most everybody else too.
Harry rolled his eyes, but didn't respond to this. How did they even know I was Harry Potter though? It's not like I was wearing a sign. Oh. Well, that would be because of our scar, Harry. The most famous scar in the world, where you know who hit ye with his killing curse. Harry blinked in surprise at that. His haircut was clipped fairly short, to make sure it wouldn't get in his eyes, or be a convenient handhold, should that come up. Besides, he had learned long ago to accept that if his hair was going to stand up no matter how long he made it, he might as well wear it short so it was easy to take care of. Of course, this made the scar very obvious to anyone looking. But that was easily solved.
Harry put his hand over the scar as if he was rubbing it, while what he was really doing was placing a seal over the thing which would conceal it from notice for anyone who didn't already know it was there. By the time he removed his hand several seconds later, the seal had faded from the view. And while Hagrid would still be able to see the scar, knowing it should be there, anyone who didn't know he was Harry Potter just wouldn't notice the thing.
Well, I guess it's time to start shopping. Where should we go first? Hagrid brightened, clearly glad to be off of the subject of Voldemort. Well, first, we need to go to Gringotts Bank to get some of the money our parents left from the goblins. Harry was surprised by the mention of goblins, but didn't let it faze him. Oh, well, I brought money. I think I should have enough to cover it. Oh, well, ye can't use muggle money in Diagon Alley. Ye need wizarding money, galleons, sickles, and nuts. But Don, ye worry. Mum and Dad left ya plenty.
By this time they were approaching a large white building with columns in the front and bronze doors. Once they entered, they came to a second silver set of doors with a warning against thievery in the form of a poem engraved on them, which Harry pretty much ignored. However, he was quite interested in the short humanoids with rather inhuman features and very long fingers and feet, dressed in a uniform of red and gold.
Hagrid nodded at him as they passed and the strange thing bowed to them both as it opened the door. Hagrid nodded at the creatures and stated, That's a goblin. They run the bank.
They must have been a bloodline that separated from humanity a while back, though he had no idea why anyone would pursue a bloodline like that. He couldn't see any possible advantages. It was obvious what the bloodline Hagrid was descended from gave, great strength and probably durability, though it didn't seem quite worth it to Harry, given the negatives of such inconspicuous size and, if Hagrid was any indication, probably reduced intelligence. In the case of these goblins, though, it was likely that some advantages did exist, and were simply not physically obvious. Otherwise the bloodline wouldn't have lasted, and certainly wouldn't have grown into what was considered an entire species of people. It was something to think about and if necessary, do some research on, at a later time. For now, they approached a long counter with a row of goblins sitting on high stools writing in ledgers and weighing coins while they dealt with the lines of wizards. Moving to one of the open goblins, Hagrid greeted him and said, "Mornin', we've come to take some money out of Harry Potter's trust vault." The goblin briefly glanced up at Hagrid before giving an even briefer look at Harry. "You have his key, sir. Got it here somewhere." At this point Hagrid started emptying many of his numerous pockets out onto the counter looking for the key, apparently. Harry actually ended up being slightly impressed by just how much junk the large man was carrying around with him. The goblin looked decidedly less impressed as old pieces of biscuits and many other objects that had no business being in a man's pockets were dumped onto his formerly pristine counter. "Ah, here it is." He held up a small golden key, which the goblin examined and stated his approval of. Hagrid then continued speaking, "And I've also got a letter here from Professor Dumbledore. It's about you-know-what in Vault 713. After quickly taking the letter from Hagrid and examining it, the goblin nodded. "Very well, I will have someone take you down to both vaults." Griphook. But Harry quickly interrupted at this point. "Actually, can we go down separately? If Hagrid's business is private, I probably shouldn't be involved, and I would like time to examine my own vault." Without asking, he took the key to his vault which the goblin had set on the counter while he read Hagrid's letter. This received a frown from both the goblin and Hagrid, though Hagrid seemed more confused about what to do. Harry honestly didn't care though. He got the impression that Hagrid had planned on getting that key back, and this was the best way to make sure he kept it. It was his vault, after all. Not that he really cared about money, since he could make it more or less at will, but he didn't want other people accessing his money without his permission. It was just a bad habit to allow people to get into. Harry, Dumbledore told me to look after ye today. I think it'd be best. He trailed off as Harry waved the comment away. Oh, I'm sure I will be fine. Nothing is going to happen in a trip to a vault, and it would be faster if we did both at the same time rather than me having to hang around while you went to Dumbledore's vault, and you hang around while I go to mine. Hagrid hesitantly nodded. He clearly wasn't totally comfortable going against what Dumbledore had apparently told him, but Harry was relying on the fact that Dumbledore had apparently also impressed the importance of whatever he was getting. Having seen an agreement between the two, the goblin at the counter called out for another goblin called Jarripper to take Hagrid to Vault 713, while Griphook escorted Harry, who waved at Hagrid and told him they could meet up in the lobby shortly. As he separated from Hagrid, Harry decided to strike up a conversation and learn more about goblins in general. So, how did goblins become bankers, exactly? The stories about goblins in the Muggle world always portray you more as warriors. I was pretty shocked to find you ran a bank instead. Griphook frowned heavily up at him, but finally did respond as he led him out of the lobby. Goblins are warriors. But after the last war with wizards, we agreed to be the bankers for the wizarding world, rather than continue to fight. Harry blinked in shock at this revelation. Wait, so wizards had just finished having a war with goblins, and right after it was over, it was decided to turn over all our money. You must have kicked our asses. He laughed at this point, until he trailed off when he found Griphook was definitely not laughing. With a sneer, Griphook waited until Harry stopped laughing, then answered, actually, wizards were winning the war, but being cowards, could not stand the losses they were taking in the winning, so they came to an agreement with us. All we ever wanted was your gold, so your Ministry of Magic decided to turn it over to us, if only to manage. And they agreed to that, turning over all our money to a recently hostile group that apparently openly admitted that they just wanted our gold. That seems insane. Well, yes, we often find that wizards are insane. But how did we know you wouldn't just close the doors on the bank, and laugh at us that we had willingly given you all our gold? At this Griphook's sneer turned angry and became more of a snarl as he looked at Harry. Are you accusing us of theft? That is a very serious claim. Harry cleared his throat at the tense atmosphere, though he couldn't bring himself to actually be concerned. I wasn't accusing you of anything. I was just saying it seemed like a foolish thing to do on our part, since you could have, and still could, I suppose, take advantage of our trust pretty easily, if what you want is our gold anyway. Besides, how did you get individual humans to deposit money into your vaults anyway? Right after a war, even if the government said you could open a bank, I would think wizards would continue to bank however they had before, rather than rush to bring their money to you. Griphook was still pretty displeased, but apparently somewhat mollified. Our agreement with your government made it illegal for any other than goblins to operate a bank dealing in wizarding currency. Harry was once more forced to stop in shock before he caught himself. They gave you a legal monopoly. Your interest rates must suck. If there isn't any alternative, why give good rates? Griphook was back to sneering again. Interest received for deposits is a Muggle idea. In the wizarding world, you pay us to rent a vault and guard your gold. If you wish to take a loan, we use our own gold for that. What? That's ridiculous. I can keep my own money safe, thank you very much. Can I go ahead and pull all my money out of Gringotts now? Of course Griphook was back to snarling again at this. Until your majority, you may not remove money from your family vault, only your trust vault. And even if you empty your trust vault, you cannot close it until you reach your majority anyway, and fees will continue to be charged to your family vault, regardless of the amount in the trust vault. Harry snorted and rolled his eyes. Of course they will. I guess you were right before when you thought I was accusing you of theft. An entire race of thieves who just like to do it legally, are as legal as strong-arming an entire government through the threat of continued war can be. I guess having us being the only ones who care about the lives of our people was a powerful motivator to take advantage of. It should perhaps be noted at this point that Harry had a great deal of experience in various negotiations in his previous life. However, those negotiations were almost always centered on one of two things. First, that Naruto was personal friends with almost every leader on the continent, causing negotiations to generally go fairly smoothly.
And second, the abject fear that his name gave to those who were not his friends.
He rarely actually made any sort of threats, but the knowledge that he could casually destroy your entire city by himself was always just sort of there, so people tended to rush to accommodate what he wanted. All they had to do is remember that there used to be a minor ninja village known as the village hidden in the grass, and any fear they might have forgotten came back. It had been such a long time since he had really dealt with groups opposed to him who weren't fully aware of his abilities. He was out of practice, to say the least. That, combined with his natural brashness and the total absence of any fear of, well, anything, created an interesting way of talking to those he didn't like. Harry had continued strolling along the hallway they were walking down quite casually, approaching one of what looked like a sort of a small open railroad car, which Griphook had previously been leading him towards. But he quickly stopped when he noticed the goblin had likewise stopped and was staring at him with what started as shock, but looked to be morphing into rage. What? Griphook was quick to respond. What? What? You dare accuse us of stealing what is rightfully ours by contract? I have dueled for less. Harry rolled his eyes yet again as he responded, the fact that you forced someone to make a contract doesn't make it any less stealing. In fact, it kind of highlights the stealing. If someone threatened to kill your family if you didn't sign over all your money, would that make it not stealing, just because you signed a contract agreeing to it? Griphook was spitting and snarling enough now that his words were somewhat difficult to decipher. Of course it wouldn't be stealing. But I would never sign such a thing. Contracts are sacred, and if you a wizards. Harry could hear the derision drip off of the word as Griphook drew it out before continuing, decided to sign a contract giving us rights, those are our rights, ain't no to theft. You would refuse to sign away money even if it meant your family woulda die. That's a disgusting. And from how you said it, that's just a standard way of seeing things for your culture. Ugh, well, come on little thief, show me the way to my vault. I haven't signed it away, so you have to, don't you? Harry sounded, at worst, deeply annoyed with Griphook and goblin culture at this point as he spoke. Griphook, on the other hand, was lost in his rage. Apparently goblins were used to dealing with wizards' arrogance and looking down on goblins as if they were lesser beings. They were even used to distrust in wizards who believed that goblins were greedy and possibly the Ives. They were nota used to having wizards casually openly insult their integrity and culture to their faces in goblin territory. So when Griphook lunged at Harry with clear murderous intent, Harry probably shouldn't have been surprised. But he was. Well, slightly, anyway. Not that it mattered in the slightest. Harry might still be far below what his physical abilities had once been at their height in his old body and what he hoped to reach again in this one eventually. But that wasn't saying much, since at his most powerful, Harry had been able punch hard enough to crack mountains and move fast enough it took a highly trained eyes just to hope to be able to see the blur of movement. With the lost ability to enhance his training with chakra, he was already considerably beyond anything mere normal muscles could possibly hope to match, and with over a century of practice with taijutsu, it was unlikely he would run across many who could match his skill either. So Harry didn't even have to move from where he stood as he casually flicked out his left hand to catch Griphook's leading forearm, lifting it above his head as he thrust out his right palm against the goblin's extended elbow to force the joint to bend very much the wrong way with a sharp crack. But this was just one of Griphook's worries as he went flying over Harry's head and slammed into the opposite wall, dazing him and breaking his nose and probably some teeth while he was at it. But pain wasn't enough to break through a goblin in the grip of a berserker fury. In fact, it only encouraged it. However, before Griphook could move, Harry was kneeling on his back and Griphook was suddenly filled with fear. No, more than fear, it was absolute terror. The sure knowledge that he was going to die. Killing intent was a technique in which the use of chakra was employed to focus a ninja's pure will and sure knowledge that they could kill someone and inflict that knowledge on another. Against someone with even remotely close to equal chakra reserves who knew how to keep a focused mind, it was relatively easily combated. Against a goblin who didn't even have chakra reserves, just a small pool of spiritual energy and had never even heard of killing intent, it was more than enough to break him out of his frenzy and make him focus very carefully on Harry's quiet and calm words.
Now, I don't really want to fight you, but I will if I have to.
I will kill you if I have to. But you know that now, don't you?
You understand how utterly futile it is to fight me.
He paused, looking down at the very still goblin, feeling slight pity for the now rather pathetic creature. On the other hand, nothing he had said was untrue, and he refused to tiptoe around a bunch of thieves who got off on terrorizing humans into agreeing to their demands. So after a short pause, he continued, "Nod if you agree." A short but emphatic nod was what he immediately got, so Harry stood up off of Griphook's back. Good. Besides, if you had killed me, imagine the trouble goblins would be in for killing the boy who lived. Now take me to my vault, and hopefully we won't see each other again until I come after my majority to empty out my family vault. After another short pause in which he let Griphook consider this point, Harry continued, "Now, if you would like, I can heal your injuries for you, and we can continue on down to my vault." But Griphook just glared at him, though his eyes quickly dropped, unable to meet Harry's steady gaze as he turned away and led the boy to one of the carts, cradling his useless arm and ignoring his fairly heavily bleeding face. The trip through the tunnels in the goblin's cart was done in silence. Harry kept his Sharingan active to memorize the pathway in all of the vaults past, but kept any opinion to himself. He was tempted to ask if the cart could go any faster, as the trip might have actually been made exciting if so. Griphook clearly wasn't in the mood though, and it probably wasn't the time to be pushing things. Harry liked to think he could demonstrate some restraint sometimes, at least. So eventually they reached a large vault door and Griphook requested Harry's key while clearly struggling to keep his snarl under control. But he did manage it, seeming to remember the fear he had felt so briefly, yet so strongly, only minutes before. So he took the key and slid it into the large door, opening it to reveal literal piles of gold, silver, and bronze. It was enough to make even Harry's eyes widen. Sure, he could have created duplicate stacks of gold easily enough, but this was presumably natural precious materials, and a lot more than Harry had assumed. It was supposed to be a trust vault after all, so Harry had thought it would likely just be enough to comfortably make his way through school, not piles that had to be a decent fortune even for an adult. He was sure he could probably come up with some sort of use for it eventually though.
So Harry entered the vault and almost closed the door behind him to give privacy. He did make sure to send a quick glare towards the goblin before doing so, as he was sure the temptation to slam the door shut and try and leave him there would exist.
Harry almost hoped he would. Griphook's expression when he stepped out of the black flames devouring the massive metal door was sure to be hilarious. But he was pretty sure that now that the goblin had his anger under control, he would be aware that having the famous boy who lived disappear in goblin tunnels with no explanation would cause massive problems.
So instead, he focused on using Kamui to send all the piles of money into his personal subspace storage dimension.
Of all of the 4 abilities his Mangekyo Sharingan I granted, that one was definitely his favorite. He supposed every user of that eye had their favorite. By the end, Sasuke had been skilled enough with the flames of Amaterasu he probably could have performed surgery with the black flames. Although he had never faced it personally, from reports Itachi's mastery of the ultimate genjutsu of Tsukuyomi was said to be so great he could control every aspect of reality within the illusion, even massively bending time itself. And Madara had achieved far greater mastery with the ultimate defense of Susanoo than any before or since. Not even he could have quite matched any of them in their specialty, even after decades of practice and near infinite chakra reserves to use in the techniques. But in the fourth technique of Kamui, the ultimate space-time manipulation of the Mangekyo Sharingan, he had been able to surpass even its proclaimed master. Of course, it sometimes made him question himself that he had followed in the footsteps of Toby, of all people, but it was still his favorite and most useful of the Sharingan's techniques. Effectively, what the technique allowed was stepping or sending someone or something out of reality. You could then step back to whatever location you wished, allowing near-instant teleportation to anywhere without even the need for seal markers like the Hiraishin required. Or you could use it as an attack to send an enemy, or part of an enemy into null space, as he called it, or even as a defense to send an attack there. You could step into a subspace dimension to store whatever you wanted there, accessible only by you. Harry had even managed to find a way to link this dimension to his soul so it came with him, allowing him to bring a stockpile of weapons, and other materials he thought he might not have access to in the future. He had even been able to bring a number of barrels of Ichiraku ramen under stasis seals, just in case he wasn't able to obtain the right ingredients to make it, though thankfully that hadn't ended up being an issue. And finally, it was possible to make a sort of half-step into null space, allowing you to observe an area and be seen, but be totally immaterial and immune to attacks, though most attacks were impossible from that state as well. The incredible versatility of Kamui just made it so useful, even if it was less blatantly powerful than Amaterasu or Susanoo, and he just rarely had the need to spend subjective days torturing someone in a few seconds, so Tsukuyomi rarely even came up. But with all of his money safely put away, he reopened the vault door and gave a bright smile at the thieving goblin. Okay, I'm ready to go. The trip back to the lobby was just as awkwardly silent as the cart ride down had been, and Harry even noticed Griphook looking over at the guards, and had to wonder if he was thinking about calling them over, but apparently decided it wouldn't be a good idea. Certainly he noticed all the guards looking strangely at the bloody and wounded goblin with torn and rumpled clothes escorting Harry. Even Hagrid noticed that as he walked over and gave one strange look at Griphook before looking back at Harry. So, everything all right then, Harry? But Harry just smiled widely at him and said in an excited voice. Yeah, it was pretty boring, but it went fine. Now let's go see what's in Diagon Alley. Ragnarok was in equal measure incredulous and displeased. Neither were generally common emotions for the Goblin King of the British Isles. But he was certainly feeling them today as he glared down at the kneeling Griphook. So let me make sure I understand you correctly. You are saying that Potter walked in, and in the short time it took to walk from the lobby to the carts, he called not just you, but goblins in general thieves, and said he was disgusted by our culture. You then attempted to attack this 11-year-old child, Buddha failed. At which point you meekly took him to his vault, which he emptied. And he stated he plans to empty his family vault upon his majority, a vault which has been in our control for centuries. Would that be an accurate summary? Griphook pressed his upper body and face harder against the ground from his kneeling position. His still broken nose and arm probably hurt a lot in that position. Ragnarok deeply hoped so.
Well, yes, Your Majesty. Factually speaking, that is correct.
However, he hurried to elaborate, but he is far more powerful than any 11-year-old should be. More powerful than an adult should be. I may not be a renowned warrior such as yourself, but I am well trained, yet he handled me like a newborn puppy. I didn't even see him move, and he threw me across the room with one arm. And the fear he could project was unbelievable. I couldn't even move. You may think me. He hesitated at this point, but forced the words out. You may think that I am a coward, but he was not someone who could be faced by the likes of me. Not and have any chance of survival. Ragnarok idly toyed with the hilt of his sword as he examined the sniveling goblin in front of him. One of the most pathetic specimens he had ever seen, in fact. Perhaps. But if that was the case, you should have died like an honorable goblin, not lived like this. Perhaps then we could have done something to avenge you, taking your body to the ministry as evidence of Potter's crimes in our caves. But it is good that you failed. The boy wasn't wrong that killing him would have drastic repercussions for us. We are not yet ready for war with the wizards, and that is what might well have come from such an act. Still, something must be done. The loss of gold when he closes the Potter accounts, and possibly the black accounts as well, is bad enough. Add to that the possible damage of word getting out that the boy who lived believes goblins to be untrustworthy thieves, and there may be movement for greater restrictions on us, leading once again to a war we are not ready for. And of course, that doesn't consider the dishonor done to you, your clan, and all goblins. Griphook waited for a few seconds, but eventually couldn't take the pressure and asked, "What would you have me do to make up for this dishonor?" Slowly a grin formed on Ragnarok's face. A grin filled with sharp teeth and the sure knowledge that death and humiliation would come to his enemies. "I am told you are clever, Griphook. Not the most skilled warrior, but cunning, at least. So perhaps it is right that you be the one to make up for your own failure. First, you shall make sure that you sell the information that Potter has withdrawn around 100,000 galleons out of the safety of the bank to the right parties. Given what you described, it is unlikely, but it's always possible someone will get lucky and take care of our problem for us. At worst, it should cause problems for the boy. Then it will be up to you to find out where Potter's weak spots lie. Friends, family, reputation, I don't care. Find out what he treasures. Then we will know exactly where to push. And once we know that and can take appropriate measures against these vulnerabilities, we will force him to come to us. Then he will either be on his knees begging for forgiveness and signing a binding contract with certain concessions of his own, or he will die, but in a way that cannot be traced back to us."
Oh, and Griphook. You will take care of any bribes or payments necessary from your own clan's accounts.
"This is first and foremost to your honor you seek to regain. It is disgraceful enough that you must come to me for help. You shall at least pay for your own solution." At this point the Goblin King leaned forward and growled with even greater intensity. "And know this, Griphook. This is your only opportunity to regain lost honor. You shall find a way to crush Potter, one way or the other, or you will die, and I will find one who can." Hagrid was still giving him strange looks as they left the bank, but he was either too courteous to ask, or just didn't know how to go about asking what exactly had happened that ended with Harry's goblin escort having a broken arm and nose. And as the man eventually opened his mouth, possibly to ask, Harry quickly interrupted him by asking in an excited voice, "So, where should we go first? Seems like there are all kinds of interesting shops." Right. I suppose ye should be getting uniform first. Do ye think ye mind if I headed over ta the Leaky Cauldron Fair a bit of a pick-me-up? I hate them Gringotts carts. Ye can just head into Madame Malkin's, and she'll take care of ye." Harry still thought the idea of everyone wearing robes was a little strange, but Haya Hada spent decades wearing the Hokage's robes, which he had hated, except for the hat. The hat had still been awesome even after 40 years. Still, if he had to wear robes, he could grin and bear it. So he just looked up at the big man. "Oh, yeah. Sure. Take your time. If I finish up at the robes shop, I will head over to the bookstore and spend some time looking around there. I would like to do that anyway." Not that he particularly enjoyed reading, but unfortunately, this was one of the times when it was necessary to do a little reading as soon as possible. There was a pretty wide range of things he could do with chakra, and he had no intention of just not using any of that just to avoid being accused of doing the impossible. But it would be very important to know what he could pass off as some weird rare power, and what people believed was just totally impossible. He ought at least wanted to be ready to memorize people's reactions with the Sharingan when he did casually do those impossible things. And the tiny part of him that most people would call their sense of caution, and he just called annoying, was telling him he should probably avoid breaking too many magical theories and laws. Still, it was probably a good idea for the time being. If nothing else, it would be easier to get away with pranks using these impossible abilities if it wasn't known he could use them. So with that thought restoring the smile to his face, he waved towards Hagrid and entered Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. It turned out that Madame Malkin was a short overweight woman who was wearing all purple robes. It made him question if coming to her for any sort of fashion advice was a good idea, but given what he had seen from other wizards in Diagon Alley so far, maybe something like this was required to fit in. Perhaps he could convince her that orange robes were the way to go. These might be the first people he could find that might actually agree with him that clothes should be made in such an awesome color. But eventually his fantasies were interrupted by the woman in front of him. Hogwarts, dear, we have had a lot of you in recently. In fact, we have one being measured right now. She motioned towards the pale boy with blonde, almost white, hair. Well, come this way and we will get you measured and ready quick. Harry just shrugged in response and followed her, motioning to a stool next to the other kid. As he glanced over at the other boy, mostly ignoring the woman who was measuring him, he asked, "So are you going to be a first year at Hogwarts too?" The boy looked over at Harry for the first time as he responded, "Oh, yes. I'm looking forward to it. It's really not fair that they won't let us take brooms in our first year though. I was going to go look at racing brooms next. I think I will get my father to get me one and smuggle it in somehow." "Yeah, I saw that they were not allowing us to bring brooms." Harry smiled over at the other boy as he responded. It seemed a weird restriction. I guess flying around on brooms does seem like it might be a little dangerous, but they let us bring wands. Surely those are more dangerous if used incorrectly. At least you are only risking your own neck on a broom, rather than someone else's. Hey, yeah, that's a good point. There are loads of spells to hurt someone more than a fall from a broom, and they let us use those. If we already know how to fly a broom, we should be allowed. Not that a rule is going to stop me from bringing a broom, he stated arrogantly, but with a grin. So, what position do you play in Quidditch? Harry frowned at this. So far in the conversation, he had been keeping up reasonably easily. He had seen the restriction on first years bringing brooms, and between the Muggle legends of witches on brooms and this boy's comment about racing brooms, it was pretty easy to figure out that apparently magical people flew around on brooms, as ridiculous as that sounded. But he had never heard of anything called Quidditch, so he asked, "What is Quidditch? Is that a wizard sport of some kind?" The blond boy almost gasped, and after a moment a slightly disgusted expression came onto his face as he subtly shifted away from Harry. Or possibly the boy was constipated. "Oh, so you're a mudblood then?" Harry almost laughed at the kid's expression, but managed to restrain himself. "I don't actually know what a mudblood is, but it sounds like some sort of insult." The blonde sneered and replied, "It's not an insult, it's just a description. You mudbloods don't know anything about magical society or our ancient traditions, trying to imitate a muggles all the time. Father says that you are the reason Hogwarts and the rest of the wizarding world are declining. That they shouldn't allow your kind into Hogwarts, and only allow in the old families." Harry paused for a few seconds, still surprised by this sudden outburst. "Oh, I see. You are just an idiot. Well, carry on, I guess. Try to limit how much you pollute our air with your stupidity though. We would all appreciate it, I think." The blonde gaped at him, probably shocked at the first time in his life someone had spoken to him like that. Well, if they were going to be in the same classes, it probably wouldn't be the last. "What? How dare you? Wait until my father." Ouch. He cut off as the woman measuring him, who had been glaring unnoticed by the blonde since he started his rant, pricked him with her needle. In a too sweet voice, she said, "Oh. So sorry, dear. Well, you are finished up. Why don't you head out?" The boy glared at the woman as well before once again putting his nose into the air as he arrogantly stomped out of the store. But just as the door was swinging shut behind him, Harry grinned and manipulated a little fire chakra to make his overly gelled hair burst into a 3-foot pillar of flame. He was also careful to manipulate the fire to keep all the heat away from the kid's scalp. In fact, it probably felt like a cool breeze was blowing through his hair, rather than it being consumed in an unnaturally large fire. But of course the prank didn't end there. Before the formerly blonde-haired boy noticed his head was on fire, people nearby in the alley started screaming and pointing, greatly confusing Harry's new favorite target. And then it got better. Half a dozen of the surrounding crowd, including Wada Hada to be the Ponce's father, given the similarities of appearance, all unleashed torrents of water from their wands towards the literally flaming boy. One of these streams of water probably would have been enough to knock him over, given that he had no warning or understanding of why people were suddenly attacking him with water. All half dozen together were enough to send him tumbling down the street a good dozen feet, before he finally ended up a thoroughly soaked, mostly bald boy with heavily singed and ripped clothes. Silence filled the street for a moment as the boy's father rushed forward to explain why he had been blasted by water, but this silence was broken by Harry's laughter. He had quickly moved to the entrance of the shop to get a better view while the tailor had been distracted by the fire, and now that it was over, he was incapable of keeping hold of his laughter any longer at the sight of the incredibly disheveled child. Some of the surrounding crowd quickly turned their own chuckles into coughs as the bald child pointed at the loudly and openly laughing Harry and said, You did this. My father is going to ruin you, you little mudblood. Most of the crowd remained silent, apparently torn between humor and disapproval at the slur, but Harry continued to laugh. However, he did manage to sputter out a few sentences between guffaws. Me. You think I did this? But I'm just a mudbluda who hadn't even gone to Hogwarts, nor gotten my wand. How could I have done this? I'm just laughing because you look. Does someone have a camera? Surely this needs to be immortalized. The bald boy continued to snarl mostly incoherently, but his father quickly grabbed him and murmured, Come on Draco, quickly ushering him away from the crowd. Apparently he was less eager to see his son photographed at this moment than Harry was. Harry kept laughing for another half a minute as he clutched the door frame to Madame Malkin's before he noticed the weird looks people were giving him. But he shrugged that off and headed back into the shop to finish getting measured. While that was happening, Malkin's assistant who had earlier been measuring Draco looked up at him a little hesitantly, then quietly said, You need to be careful around people like him. Yeah, they might be jerks, but the pureblood families have a lot of power in this world. The Malfoys more than most. And things can be difficult enough for people like us in this world without purebloods actively trying to make things harder. Harry glanced over at her and smiled as he replied. Malfoy. That's the Draco kid's last name. And what do you mean? People like us? Oh, well, Muggleborns. Harry's eyes widened in realization. Oh, that's what he meant when he was talking about mudbloods. People who have Muggle parents. He was going on about people who didn't know about magical society, but never really defined what mudblood referred to. Other than someone who doesn't know what Quidditch is, apparently. I think I will be fine though. It's not like I was going to actually get along with that kid regardless of what first impressions were. She shrugged uncomfortably at his dismissive attitude, but didn't say anything else as she finished the measuring. A few minutes later, Harry found himself in the bookstore called Flourish and Blots, where he approached the owner. Ah, here for your school books for Hogwarts. What year are you? I know each of the lists by heart, so no need to give specifics. Just electives if you are that far. Sure, I'm a first year. I was hoping you could help me with a couple other books too though. He followed the older man along as he collected each of the required textbooks for his first year. Well, really I need two things. First, I was hoping that there was some sort of comprehensive introduction to the wizarding world for Muggleborns. I keep hearing references to stuff that is common knowledge to those born in this world that it seems almost expected I know as well, regardless of the fact I have known of magic for all of a week. Oh, sure, we have something like that. Of course you were given the standard pamphlet with your letter, like goes to all Muggleborns, but you are right that it is hardly enough to do more than introduce the very basics. Here you are. Harry didn't comment on the reference to a pamphlet he had certainly not received, but just accepted the book as the shopkeeper handed Avera an introduction to what you need to know about magic for Muggleborns, by Muggleborns. This one is the best. There are a couple similar things written by purebloods about wizarding society and culture that might be good later, but I have been told that they apparently are not very good at first introducing the new concepts to Muggleborns that we tend to just take for granted. Yeah, that looks good. Also, I was hoping you could point me in the right direction for a book detailing mythical magical abilities, or something like that. This caused the bookstore owner to furrow his brow in confusion. Well, that's a little more uncommon of a request, especially from a Muggleborn first introduced to magic. Usually you want to know all about cool curses and what kind of interesting spells you will be taught at Hogwarts. But I think I do have something along those lines. He spent a minute looking down one of stacks in the back of the store before eventually smiling as he pulled out a Lost Powers, Tales of the Legendary Magical Abilities Lost to Our World, and handed it over to Harry. Harry grinned at the man and replied, "This looks great. Thanks." Hagrid had entered the bookstore not long after that, and had escorted him around to pick up the rest of his school supplies. It was pretty boring for the most part, though Harry made sure to remember that he needed to come back to the apothecary and pick up some of the more useful potions he had seen in passing. Just wand left. Oh, and I need to get Ye a birthday present. Oh, that's nice of you. You don't have to do that though. I mean, we just met, and you already got me the cake. Ah, well, I know I don't have ta, but I was friends with Ye mum and dad, and I wish I had been able to get Ye presents every birthday. I know. How about a pet? Ye are allowed to bring a toad, a cat, or an owl. An owl is best though. Useful, 'cause they can carry mail, and they mostly look after themselves. Harry was a little skeptical though. After all, he could teleport wherever he wanted, and so could wizards from what he had seen. What was the point of mail at all? Well, I guess. An owl seems kind of boring though. Can't I get something interesting like a dragon or dire wolf? Do those actually exist? Hagrid got a giant smile at that comment, though the smile mostly faded away after a few moments. Well, I would love to help Ye out in that, but dragons and dire wolves are a little misunderstood by the ministry. Dragons are illegal to own, except by licensed dragon reserves. And dire wolves have been mostly hunted into extinction. At this point, Hagrid's eyes started to become a little watery and he started sniffing loudly. I would love to have one myself. Especially a dragon. It's always been a dream of mine. But a nice dire wolf pack would be great too. Huh, that's too bad. Well, if all the interesting pets are controlled by the ministry, I suppose an owl would be nice too in case I need to send a letter for some reason, I guess. They ended up settling on a pure white snowy owl which seemed to like him. It did take a while to name the thing something that she didn't immediately reject though. It was actually kind of strange to watch the bird turn its beak away at each name offered, before it eventually nodded at Hagrid's suggestion of Hedwig, who was apparently someone from magical history. Certainly it wasn't behavior Harry was used to from birds, not even those well trained to carry messages. He had at first thought that something magical was done to the owls to make them much more intelligent, but Hagrid denied this. According to him, there were a few spells cast on the birds to improve their ability to carry letters and find the correct recipient, but nothing that would make it act like this. Harry just shrugged and told Hedwig that he was very impressed with her intelligence. He didn't want to spend a lot of time on it though, because it was time for him to get his wand, which he had been looking forward to. And so they entered a store with a sign which read Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 B.C. It probably said something about him that his immediate reaction to seeing the sign was to lay a genjutsu on it which changed it to read Ollivanders, masturbators of fine wands since 382 B.C. as he walked in. He might have 2 centuries of experience, but if he was going to be forced to live as a kid again, he was at least going to enjoy the benefits of being allowed to be immature. The inside of the shop was very dim and filled with tight rows of stacks of small, narrow boxes which he assumed held wands. The shop also held a creepy old man under some kind of invisibility magic. It was a pretty good spell too, and Harry might have missed him if it were not for the Sharingan's ability to see the magic of the spell. It seemed like this Ollivander liked scaring people, or possibly just deliberately being weird. So when he dropped his invisibility spell and greeted him, Harry just grinned at the man and replied, "Hello, Mr. Ollivander. I'm here to get my wand." If Ollivander was surprised that Harry hadn't jumped at his appearance like Hagrid did, he concealed it well, only giving a small twitch of one eyebrow. "Ah, yes, well, I thought I would be seeing you soon, Mr. Potter. You have your mother's eyes. It seems only yesterday she was in here herself, buying her first wand. 10¼ inches, swishy, made of willow. Nice wand for charm work. Your father, on the other hand, favored a mahogany wand. 11 inches. Pliable, a little more power, and excellent for transfigurations. Though of course it is the wand that chooses the wizard." By this point Ollivander had approached so close that his face was almost touching Harry's. Yes, his new sign out front would probably get him in trouble if he acted this way all the time. Maybe that would teach him to tone the creepiness a while down.
So, that's nice about my parents, but can I get my wand now?
Ah yes. The man gave another of his odd smiles with his glinting silver eyes as he pulled out a tape measure. "Which is your wand arm?" "Well, I'm right-handed, if that's what you mean." After the apparently magical tape measure took a number of measurements from him, many of which couldn't possibly be relevant, Ollivander finally started to hand him wands and asked that he wave them, all of which seemed to produce none of the results the man was looking for. This went on for about half an hour before Ollivander finally muttered to himself, "Tricky customer, I see. Well, we may as well try it. Holly and Phoenix Feather, an odd combination, but it might just work for you. 11 inches, nice and supple." Harry shrugged and grabbed the wand from Ollivander, much like so many others' attempts. It was at that point that things deviated sharply from how they had gone before. While he had been testing wands, he had asked Ollivander what exactly was supposed to happen. The man had claimed that the reaction differed a little with each wand and each customer, but that generally sparks or an aura, or sometimes music appeared. This was not what happened when Harry waved the Holly and Phoenix wand. Instead, it exploded. It didn't make something in front of it explode. Well, yes, it did that too, but more importantly to Harry is that the wand itself ignited into a fireball while in his hand, along with everything for about 10 feet in front of the wand. Harry rapidly channeled chakra into the limb to reinforce it, preventing more than his skin and a bit of the muscle in his hand from being burned away. Luckily, though the fire had burned fairly hot, it had been very brief before the wand itself was consumed in flames, leaving only ashes to fall away from Harry's hand. A few of the smaller bones in his hand were also broken from the force of the explosion even with chakra reinforcement, but Harry wasn't too concerned about that. As long as none of his hand was actually blown off, he should regenerate fast enough to cover it up. In fact, given the fact that Ollivander had leapt out of the way at the last moment, but still been caught in the edges of the flames, he wouldn't really need to make any distractions at all. Hagrid tried to rush over to ask if he was okay, but Harry just waved him away with his left hand and told him to go check on Ollivander. By the time Ollivander had been able to extinguish the smoldering of his robes and cast a few minor healing spells on his own burns, Harry was able to remove his once again whole right hand from where he had hidden it in his robes. "So, I assume that wasn't normal. Sorry about all your wands too." Harry pointed over one of the large stacks of wand boxes which had been more or less consumed in the explosion. "Oh my, how interesting. No, not to worry, Mr. Potter. Hopefully I can salvage some of them, and if not, well, it wasn't your fault. And to be able to see such a thing is worthwhile of its own merit. I'm glad your hand is okay as well. Perhaps the magic released protected it from the damage somehow." Harry frowned at that, and waited for Ollivander to continue. However, The man had just trailed off and was now staring at him in an almost predatory fashion, so Harry uncomfortably asked, "Such a thing? What does that mean, exactly? I assume you didn't expect something like this." Ollivander chuckled almost gleefully. "Oh, no, of course not. Why, something like that hasn't happened for centuries. And even then, I doubt it was remotely to this extent." Hagrid just looked between the two of them with a confused expression, but Harry was starting to get more annoyed than disturbed by Ollivander. Something like Kia Wada exactly. What made the wand explode like that? Ollivander was grinning wildly by this point. "Oh, you were much too powerful for the wand. You see, that wanda did choose you, just as a wand is meant to. But in the moment that a wand chooses a wizard, it pulls upon the wizard's magic, which rushes into the wand. That's what creates the normal effects of sparks, an aura, or whatever else happens, pure undirected magic flowing through the wand. But a wand can only handle so much magic. Destroying a wand because too much magic flowed through it is incredibly rare though. Mostly because frankly the vast majority of wizards don't have enough magic to make their wands smoke even if they were trying, much less something like the display you just did on accident. But also because generally by the time even the most powerful wizard is strong enough to manage something like that, they have learned the control not to. That an 11-year-old is strong enough to accidentally release power that Dumbledore or the like would have difficulty releasing on purpose is simply extraordinary. Harry snorted in amusement at that. He really shouldn't have been surprised. This sort of thing was exactly the type of thing he had struggled with for years in his childhood as Naruto before he had managed to get his chakra control to a reasonable level. He overloaded jutsus before, now he was overloading wands. Well, it's nice that this is so extraordinary and has caught your interest, but is there a way to fix it? The letter said I needed a wand for Hogwarts. In fact, it kind of seems like the most important part. Ollivander did finally settle down from his previous euphoric state at that. "Ah, yes indeed. Well, while I have never had a customer with this particular problem before, the solution should be fairly simple. Just use a wand which has not chosen you. The only real difference between a wand which has chosen you and is highly compatible with you and one which has not is that the more compatible a wand is with its user, the more it magnifies their magic. Using one that is very incompatible will have the opposite effect. Instead of magnifying the magic flowing through it, it will reduce the power from what you send into the wand. Ideally into an amount that does not overload the wand. Just pick one you tried earlier and focus on the feeling you probably felt the moment before the wand, air, exploded. It might take a little while, but you need to push your magic down your arm and into the wand, rather than having it pull like it does when a wand chooses you. Ideally less magic than last time though." Harry nodded and waited to make sure everyone was out of the line of fire this time before picking up a random wand which looked nice and pushing as little spiritual energy into it as he could manage. It wasn't that difficult. He didn't know how to actually craft magic into spells, but the feeling of its movement through him when the wand chose him wasn't that different from chakra manipulation, so he could duplicate it fairly easily. This time the fireball only extended about 5 feet in front of him, and Harry had been prepared for it by hardening the skin of his hand to near diamond levels with earth manipulation to prevent damage. So Harry was pretty pleased with his progress, though he expected Ollivander might be upset with the further damage to his little shop. He was very wrong about that. If anything, Ollivander seemed more bizarrely excited than before. Definitely a tricky customer, yes. The trickiest I have ever encountered in all my years. Try a few more. Let's see if we can get an even less compatible one. And try and focus on less magic as well. And so Harry tried another half-dozen wands, all of which produced slight variations in the size of the explosion and flames, but all of which were definitely reduced to ash after Harry was finished with them. And with each destroyed wand, Ollivander's grin grew wider, until it was almost inhuman in size. Finally, he said, "Okay, that's enough. Clearly I will have to do something special for you. Come back tomorrow afternoon and I will have something that should work." It may well be my finest creation yet. I think that we can expect great things from you though. Great things indeed. And at that Harry quickly headed back into the alley, eager to get away from the old man with the still creepy grin who was for some reason beyond pleased that he had completely trashed the man's shop. Even using magic for assistance, it would take hours to put his shop back in order, and Harry had totally destroyed a good 10% of Ollivander's entire stock. Anyone that pleased after something like that was someone Harry thought it was probably a good idea to avoid. Well, I guess it's time to get home, Hagrid. We still need to have that cake you brought. He grinned brightly at the large man, who smiled more